Good morning, everybody. I'm Heidi Potter. I'm the Chief Executive of the Japan Society and very pleased to see you here this Saturday morning. I welcome Mark Bookman heartily. He's a historian of disability policy and connected social movements in the Japanese and a transnational context. At the moment, he's a postdoctoral fellow at Tokyo College, and he holds a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania on politics and prosthetics, 150 years of disability in Japan, which you can find online if you would like to download and read up on it afterwards. Mark's research has been supported by many organizations, including the Fulbright US Student Fellowships in Japan and the Japan Foundation. He also works as an accessibility consultant, in which capacity he's collaborated with government agencies and corporate entities in Japan and beyond, including the International Paralympic Committee. And I'm sure Mark will explain a little bit more about his career and his work generally during his talk. It's lovely to see you all, and it's a particular pleasure to welcome Mark this evening for him in Japan. And thank you very much indeed, Mark, for joining us today. I'll hand straight over to you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Just give me one moment while I share my screen. Okay, so hello everyone. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciate you coming out today. I know it's a busy time, and certainly there have been a lot of events of local and global significance as of late. So I appreciate you coming here to join me and join us for this conversation. So today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about physical disability in contemporary Japan and what I'm calling the politics of inclusion. Before I start, I'd like to speak a little bit about myself, just so you can get an idea of who I am and how I approach these issues. So as mentioned earlier, I'm a historian of disability in Japanese and global contexts, currently based at Tokyo College within the University of Tokyo. And I also work as an accessibility consultant on matters pertaining to inclusive education, equitable built environments, and disaster risk management strategies for diverse populations of disabled people. I've worked with numerous government agencies and corporations, as well as the International Paralympic Committee and the United Nations. So how did I come into research on disability in Japan? As an American, what brought me into this idea of international accessibility consulting? To explain that story, I really have to take you back to my childhood. So I was born with a rare neuromuscular disease called glycogen storage disease type 4. It's a rare variant of that disease, which affects approximately 6 people on the planet. Essentially, the way that it works is my muscles get weaker over time, kind of like a muscular dystrophy or an ALS. And because of that, when I was 10 years old, I had a heart transplant. Now, having had a heart transplant, I was not able to go outside. I spent most of my life in the hospital, and that gave me plenty of time to, one, kind of think about what made me different from my peers. Why was I alone as a child, not outside on the playground? Became interested in philosophy. And at the same time, I had a lot of time to watch television and enjoy media because I wasn't able to do much else. And this was the early 2000s, so Japanese anime had just started showing up on television. And I saw bodies for the first time that resembled my own, connected to wires, disabled in various ways that were not seen on American television at the time. And I became interested in learning more about the country and culture where this anime had come from. So I traveled to Japan for the first time in 2008. And ever since then, I've been going back and forth. So I guess it's been around 15 years now. And, you know, I wasn't sure what my life would be like in Japan. I didn't know what to expect. But what I found is that there are many barriers that prevented me from accessing different parts of society. Let me briefly explain what I mean. So every day in Japan, I wake up with help from a caregiver who helps me to transfer from my electric hospital bed into my wheelchair, which, an engineer had to build. I then take that wheelchair across a barrier-free apartment that an architect designed, and I head out towards the train station. On the street, on my way to the station, I follow tactile pavement, the raised yellow blocks you're seeing there for blind and visually impaired individuals and other groups who can benefit from them as they guide them towards the train station. These are set up by an urban planner. I then get to a train station where I pay for my ticket with a government-issued disability pass. And I have a train station attendant pull out a ramp for me so that I'm able to take my wheelchair onto the train and ride towards my destination. Eventually, I reach my school where I work, and there I have academic administrators prepare accommodations for me to make sure I can do my job effectively. They adjust my desk height. They make sure that I'm able to reach the papers I need, things like that. Essentially, my life in Japan has been like a puzzle where different stakeholders from different parts of society come together and help me live in a way that I want, in a way that enables my independence and self-determined living. But there's a problem. And the problem is that these different stakeholders aren't always coordinated. Their actions don't necessarily come together to fit what I need as an individual. They might not be thinking about me as the 31-year-old white American large wheelchair user. They might have a different idea of what accessibility means or who they're building for. So when the pieces don't come together, it's a problem. You can think about it kind of like this picture of a bridge. This bridge says, in Japanese, wheelchair accessible pathway, right? Well, I can tell you as a large wheelchair user, my wheelchair would not be able to get across this. I would certainly fall in the water. Now, a different sized wheelchair might be able to navigate this. But again, the architect who designed this bridge didn't necessarily coordinate with the engineer who built my wheelchair, nor did they ask me as an individual what I need. So I was not able to use this type of accessibility, even if it was offered. Now, I'm not alone in dealing with this, what I'll call politics of inclusion. Many disabled people in Japan deal with similar problems, whether it's because of their age or their gender or their class. And in fact, this is not accessibility is not just a conversation about disabled people. We can think about old people, pregnant parents, people with small children who also need accessibility when they go around. They're also affected by this politics of inclusion. Accessibility is designed for some groups and not for others. And in fact, this is not just a conversation about Japan, this is a conversation about the entire world. Why? Because Japan has the world's third largest economy and fastest aging population. So different countries have learned from Japan. They've taken its accessible robots, its bridges, its trains, and exported them to Taiwan, to Germany, to the United Kingdom. And likewise, Japan has learned models from other countries, the United States, different places in Europe, and implemented them. So the politics of accessibility for local Japanese people and for global populations based on Japanese precedent is something that exists and has been changing for a while now. And as a researcher and as an individual with disability, I'm very interested in who gets included, when, why, and what we can do to make a more inclusive society. So these are the questions that I think about and that led to my work as both a historian and an accessibility consultant. And suffice it to say, they are the basis of the doctoral dissertation that I wrote that was mentioned earlier, Politics and Prosthetics, 150 Years of Disability in Japan. I'm now preparing to publish that work as a book. And unfortunately, I don't have time to walk us through the entirety of that work today. But I do want to speak for a little while about some of the key findings. That is, what is it about Japan's history that has led some groups of people with some types of disabilities to be included in educational, employment, entertainment spaces at some points in time, and some other groups of people to be excluded? I want to think more about who is left out and how do we include them. So let's start that conversation. I'm going to say that if you want to understand what's going on right now in terms of accessibility and politics of inclusion in Japan, you really have to go at least as far back as the end of World War II. So when Japan loses the war, there are a number of major cultural shifts. As we all know, the country is impoverished, it's bombed out, it needs to reconstruct from the ground up. Many groups of people are disadvantaged. One group of people who's particularly disadvantaged that I want to talk about are wounded veterans. So when Japan lost the war, there were over 800,000 wounded veterans repatriated from overseas or already in Japan who were suffering from a lack of welfare, a lack of employment, and a lack of resources. During the war, veterans had enjoyed a lot of access to specialized rehabilitation programs, medicine. But when Japan lost, the occupying forces were very quick to dismantle those special protections. Why? Because if Japan were to give welfare and rehabilitation to its veterans, they might remilitarize. That was the concern. And just as there was international reason not to give welfare and support to veterans, there was also domestic stigma. For many locally in Japan, veterans were seen as indigent losers who, could not help the nation win the war and therefore should be shunned. So there was a lot of barriers to welfare for veterans. But their numbers were not small. And Japanese policymakers knew that if they didn't find a solution for the veteran welfare problem, there would be mass riots and protests. So they started thinking in terms of what the occupying forces might be inclined to accept as a policy proposal. If they couldn't give welfare to veterans, then we needed to find a more egalitarian, a more democratic way of giving welfare to more people. This was the idea of appealing to the rhetoric of the occupiers to make sure that local policies could pass. The first solution suggested was, let's make a welfare wall for poverty. Everyone who's poor gets a pension. In theory, this would have given a certain amount of money to veterans, but in practice, everyone was poor in post-war Japan. There wasn't enough of a budget to go around. So this law, even if it was passed to give a pension, didn't really help fix the problem. The second solution was to figure out a more narrow target, a way of giving welfare to veterans that still sounded, egalitarian and democratic, but covered a narrower group of people. And this is where disability comes in. Japan passes its first disability law in 1949, primarily to cover wounded veterans, but saying they were covering other groups. In particular, blind people who could not hold a gun during the war were held up as a prime example of people who would benefit other than veterans. And in fact, the committee that made this law was comprised of 20 people. Of the 20 people, there were 5 disabled representatives on that committee, and all 5 of them were blind. Why does this matter? Well, if the law was primarily made for veterans and only had input from blind people and activists who had been there for some time, that meant that they were inclined to think about giving benefits to people with some types of conditions, but not others. So the law prioritized visual, hearing, mobility impairments, missing limbs, and central nervous disorders, what today we might think about as PTSD or conditions like that. What were excluded were conditions like birth defects, congenital illness, heart conditions, internal injuries, things that would not allow for easy reintegration into the workforce. Many groups of people were excluded from this law. Now, if their numbers had remained small, there might not have been a problem. Japan could have fixed its veteran issue, and that would have been that. But things start changing pretty rapidly when Japan enters its Reconstruction era, or as some might call it, the economic miracle, in the 1950s and 1960s. So for those who don't know, Japan enters into a major period of economic growth in the late 1950s. We see rapid industrialization, urbanization, transformation, and rebuilding of society. For many people, the factories, the power plants, these were all a sign of progress, a sign of a better future. But with every positive development came a negative consequence and a possibility for disablement. And let me explain what I mean. If you have cars, that means that you have car accidents. If you have trains, that means that you have stairs to get onto the trains. Same thing is true for skyscrapers, subway stations. If you have factories, you have pollution, and you have injury, and you have impairments that prevent you from working in them. And even medical advances, things that let people live longer, are leading to illnesses and accidents, injuries tied to old age. So with every new development, we have that many more types of disability that are not covered under Japan's welfare system. The government knew about this. They knew this was going to be a problem. So they said, we have to find a solution. We're going to make some more pensions and try and give some more money around to fix the problem, to prevent these different groups of disabled people from organizing and protesting. But just like the earlier pension for poor people, there wasn't enough money to go around. The budget was too narrow, and the groups of disabled people were too vast and too diverse. There wasn't a good way to cover everyone. And this became really apparent at the 1964 Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games. So at the Paralympic Games, you had side by side disabled athletes from Japan in makeshift wheelchairs who had not really integrated into their communities. Their devices were not fit for their bodies. And they're sitting next to foreign athletes who, to a certain extent, had integrated into community spaces, who were using much more technologically advanced devices that were custom fit for their body. The visual was so striking that the Crown Prince of Japan made a comment to the effect of, "Gee, welfare is really going well abroad, isn't it?" As if to imply that Japan was not doing well and was falling behind on the international scale. So after the 1964 Games, the Japanese government conducts a survey to see just how bad the damage is. How far behind are they? And what they find is that between 1960 and 1965, Japan's population of disabled people has increased by around 20%. Huge, huge number. And they have a dilemma. How do we accommodate so many disabled people in a way that's productive? We know pensions don't work. So what do? Well, the solution was to build large-scale residential institutions. So in theory, these facilities would allow a small number of caregivers to support the needs of a large number of disabled people. You could have 100 residents and 5 caregivers who move between rooms to help them, kind of like a hospital setting. In theory, this sounds great, but in practice, these institutions were often built outside of town, where land was cheaper. They were overcrowded. They were underfunded. Supervision became difficult. And caregivers could not easily meet the needs of those in their care because they were rushing to help too many people with too many diverse needs. So disabled people felt like they were being mistreated and often were abused in these institutions. And likewise, caregivers were dealing constantly with people who were upset with them, which would lead them towards abuse. So these institutions were not healthy for anyone involved. And as they were failing, conditions back in the city weren't much better either. The parents and friends of disabled people had to make a choice. Do we keep our relatives in the house because the train system outside, the school system outside, the employment venues outside are not accessible? Do we keep them at home and we have to stay at home and support them, so we're not able to work, we're not able to make money, we're not able to support our families' other needs? Is that an acceptable solution? For many, it wasn't. And a small few, but certainly a number of people, decided that it was better to kill their disabled relatives in what would be called mercy killings. Better to have no future than a future defined by lack of accessibility, lack of inclusion. And it was in response to the murder of disabled children and the abuses inside of institutions that some groups of disabled people started coming together and protesting for a shift in society. This was the start of a Japanese disability rights movement. So during the 1970s, as these institutions and cases of infanticide were growing, we saw disabled people partnering with other groups of individuals who have been minoritized or disenfranchised during the post-war period. So old people who were also not able to access the cities, feminists who were concerned about the welfare of themselves and their children. Multiple groups of people were being excluded. And so they joined hands and held protests for better access to education, for better access to transportation. And to some extent, demonstrations like what you can see on the right here succeeded. You know, there was a bus protest in Kawasaki in 1977 when a group of over 50 wheelchair users came together and literally hijacked a bus station, stopping traffic for 150,000 people in the greater Tokyo area. These efforts succeeded in facilitating transformation at the policy level to some extent. And even when they failed at the policy level, they inspired actors in the public and private sector to start viewing accessibility and inclusion as a consumer market, something they could appeal to. So during the 70s, we see the creation of new wheelchairs, wheelchair accessible Shinkansen, bullet trains, the removal of curb cuts on sidewalks, the installation of handrails, ramps, elevators to some extent. We're seeing the inclusion of accessibility as a market and as something that could be used to help people at the same time. And because of these developments, we see a number of success stories. So in 1977, Japan elects its first wheelchair user to the national diet, a man named Etagashiro. The diet building itself was not accessible, but because he was able to get transportation and education, was able to get access to employment, he put together a political campaign that led to him being elected to office. And he had people carry his wheelchair into the diet building up a flight of stairs every day so he could perform his duty. And yet, for every success story like Itagashiro's, there were also that many failures, perhaps more failures than successes. There was one survey that I have quoted here from the Japan Times, which says that roughly 30% of disabled people they asked said that they only went outside 1 to 3 times a month. Why? If there were so many successes, then why were people excluded? Well, the answer comes down to coordination, kind of like what I started this presentation with. You can install an accessible toilet in an office building, but if the office building itself was not accessible, it didn't matter. You could create the most perfect education system, but if there was no train to get to the school, it didn't matter. And likewise, legally mandating employment quotas for disabled people and saying that companies should hire them didn't necessarily lead to great results if schools were not accessible, so no one was qualified to take those jobs. Every sector of society was developing its own accessibility, its own inclusion, but they were developing at their own rate with a different target in mind, and therefore many people fell through the cracks. Now, this started to change in the 1980s, and more specifically in 1981 with the United Nations International Year of Disabled Persons. So in 1981, the UN hosts a major global event where disabled activists from across the world come together numerous times and discuss solutions to problems in local and global contexts. So we see activists from the UK, from America, from Canada, from all over traveling to Japan and Japanese activists traveling overseas to exchange strategies and lessons about what works and how they can better facilitate a not only an accessibility and inclusion, but a coordinated one that actually helps people. And one vehicle that was particularly effective here was learning about independent living centers, like the Berkeley Independent Living Center that was established in Berkeley, California. These were community-based service providers that would offer services like wheelchair repair, or home renovation, or guided help with transportation for clients. That they were focused on community life as opposed to institutional life. And these institutions were, or rather, these service providers were effective more so than institutions for a number of reasons. On the one hand, they didn't have to deal with all of the medical overhead that institutions dealt with, because they were providing more targeted services for a more specific clientele. So they were actually economically cheaper for that reason. And they were also economically cheaper and more effective in that way because they were designed by disabled people. Disabled persons were at the leadership positions of these institutions or of these service providing centers. And the idea made sense. A disabled person could tell you what they need and how to fix a problem more effectively than someone without disability. Their perspective would tell you the most cost-efficient and time-efficient and resource-efficient solution. So having them work side by side with welfare specialists who might not be disabled to come up with a cost-efficient solution in the community became a particularly strong tool. And as these centers began to be built in Japan, the first one was opened in 1986, we saw disabled people moving out into their communities from institutions, being able to leave their homes and start using the transportation system, start getting better access to education, start getting better access to employment. We saw community integration to some extent because of these interchanges internationally. And just as this is going on, Japan also experiences the asset bubble crash. We see an aging population that had been growing since the post-war period, those medical advances I talked about earlier. We're seeing more and more old people now almost stripped of their welfare net. When we see Japan's economy start going downhill, now there's this large group of older people who also have access needs, who also can benefit from these independent living centers and services, but who also need major social transformation. So they become a key ally for Japan's disabled populations, alongside the international advocates who they have been pushing for, or pushing with. So in the 1990s, we see these different groups of people, domestic, international, old, disabled, start coming together to lobby for a transportation system that everyone can use, a healthcare system that everyone can use. The idea is we're going to create a universal design, facilities and services that can be easily accessed and used by everyone. And because of these large movements, we see in the early 2000s, the Japanese government passing laws for the first time that mandate or regulate access to places like transportation, to places like public facilities. So train stations start having to install ramps and elevators, government offices, hospitals, related facilities, parks, start installing access where it wasn't there before. And yet there's still a problem. And the problem is that often these facilities are installed retroactively in buildings that have been there for a while. So the operators are putting the elevators at the far ends of train stations where they don't get in the way of regular flows of traffic. They meet the legal requirement, but they're not necessarily usable that easily, and they're shared by multiple groups. Because they were built with this universal design logic. Old people, disabled people, parents with small children in strollers are all using the same elevator that's already dislocated from the center of the train station. So there are serious, serious delays. I can tell you as a disabled person who was living in Japan at this time, there were days in the mid 2000s when I would have to wait half an hour or more for a train station attendant to pull out a ramp for me. That meant the people who were with me were late to where they were going, and the people who relied on me at my destination were being affected. They were also not getting whatever benefit might have come from my presence. So this wasn't just affecting disabled people. I'll give you one more example of kind of the failure of universal design, or rather its implementation. Japan also decided that it would pass a healthcare system that would give welfare benefits and healthcare benefits to everyone. But the budget was not there to establish such a system, so they decided to give a 10% deductible to everyone. You all pay 10% for your welfare services. Well, 10% looks quite different to someone who is older, who has a relatively light disability, who has a lifetime of friends and family and savings to support their lifestyle, versus someone who's younger with a more serious disability that prevents them from going to work or going to school, that doesn't have those family and friend connections, that doesn't have the savings. Their 10% for their medicine is a lot more, and they're less likely to be able to pay it. So in the late 2000s, we actually see a lot of people excluded from this system. There are puzzle pieces that have kind of fallen aside. And in fact, there are more than 77 lawsuits against the Japanese government claiming that they violated their constitutional rights. So suffice it to say that during the mid-2000s, we're seeing Japanese activists pushing back against the implementation of universal design in different ways. And just at this time on the international scale, we're seeing the United Nations introduce the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2006. So Japanese activists gained this international tool to put pressure on the government to start pushing for a more egalitarian and a more equal or equitable system to make sure that universal design is implemented properly. In the late 2000s, Japan starts pushing for better access, but it takes time. Policies don't get changed overnight. And we see the realities of what that means in 2011. So when Japan has the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown in March of 2011, we see disabled people who cannot get out of their houses to escape. They get to a shelter, and the shelter doesn't have the right accommodations, barrier-free toilets, medical supplies. And even if they have the right supplies, they're not necessarily able to race their non-disabled counterparts back into the city to get the supplies they need. So because of this, disabled people are disproportionately affected by this natural disaster. And we see, in fact, that the death rate tied to 311, according to a poll conducted by Kyoto, roughly 25% of all people who died in 311 were disabled. So it's a huge number that was heavily talked about at the time, actually. The Japanese government was heavily criticized, both domestically and internationally, for its failure to support disabled people in the aftermath of 311. And this pushed through efforts towards developing anti-discrimination legislation alongside the ongoing push for Japan's ratification of the UN Convention I mentioned earlier. So in 2013, Japan passes the Law for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Persons with Disabilities. And in 2014, Japan ratifies the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. These are domestic and international legal frameworks that are designed to eliminate the discrimination, to fix the implementation issues that were going on with universal design, to increase not just accessibility, but usability. In theory, this would have been a solution, but having the laws wasn't enough. The Japanese government still needed a way to enact, a way to get public and private stakeholders to buy in and turn these laws into reality. And that's where the recent Tokyo 2020 Olympic and Paralympic Games come in. So just as Japan is passing these new laws, we're also seeing a successful bid for the Olympic and Paralympic Games in 2013. Tokyo wins the games, and now there's a chance to enact laws using the games as a catalyst. And to be clear, we do see major changes before the games. So we see what I'll call hard accessibility upgrades, changes in the built environment, where you used to need a ramp to get onto a train, maybe that ramp is no longer necessary. Elevators being installed in places that weren't there before. This is all positive for many people. And likewise, we're also seeing what I'll call soft accessibility upgrades. By soft upgrades, I mean educational initiatives, efforts to teach the public around otherwise unseen or misunderstood barriers. So not just installing the elevator, but teaching members of the public why disabled people ought to be prioritized when using that elevator. To make sure the hard changes are actually usable, we teach why they are necessary. We see the development of what's called kokoro no barrier-free in Japanese, barrier-free mindset education programs being built into secondary education. And because we have these hard accessibility changes and soft awareness reforms, we see a number of transformations in the business sector, for instance. So some employers start calling disabled people an untapped labor force that could help Japan solve its ongoing economic crisis. We see the creation of new technologies for disabled people, new consumer markets emerging, and just like we saw in the 1970s, the election of new disabled diet members. This is a moment of celebration and success for many people. But for every success, just like in the 1970s, there have also been a number of failures and a number of constraints. So one set of constraints is tied to materiality. Japan wasn't starting from a very accessible position. In 2017, the Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism did a survey that showed that only 0.4% of hotel rooms in Tokyo were wheelchair accessible. If you're starting from 0.4%, not even 1% will make accessible, can be easily made accessible before the games. There isn't enough financial and material resources to change things overnight. And likewise, there's a major human labor constraint. If you can't rebuild the environment, maybe you can have someone help carry a wheelchair or pull out a ramp or give guidance at a train station. But when over 30% of the country is over the age of 65, it's hard to get the human resources to make sure that happens. So that was another constraint. A third constraint, and a final one I want to talk about, is awareness issues. If you're introducing these new legal frameworks, not everyone understands what they mean or what their responsibility is. In fact, there was this question around how far must a train station attendant push a wheelchair user off a train onto a platform, from a platform to the ticket gate, from the ticket gate to their house. Under the laws, they were required to provide reasonable accommodation, but what counted as reasonable and to whom was a question that was not really understood by many. And all of this got exacerbated when the pandemic broke out. You had construction projects stop. You had educational initiatives be put on hold. Awareness issues grew as people didn't know what counted as a reasonable accommodation during a social distancing era. So many disabled people were left behind. But the games provided an opportunity. With the games, we saw a chance to cast light on these problems. Activists highlighting the issues that were exacerbated by COVID, that were still there from the constraints around implementation tied to the Olympics. The games gave them the chance to showcase that. And indeed, the activists showcased accessibility, Japan's successes and failures on the global stage. So we saw Japan sending its successes, the things that it had done well, to other countries, and engaging other countries who were there for the games in brainstorming of solutions for what they could do to fix the remaining problems. Now, those conversations are still ongoing. I can't give you a definitive answer as to what their final results will be. But I can say that there are a number of events that are going on right now that are shaping those conversations and will continue to do so. So I'd be remiss if I end this talk without mentioning yesterday's tragic events, the assassination of former Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. It's obviously something that we're still processing, that we don't necessarily know how that will affect many sectors of society. But earlier today, I can say we saw another disabled candidate for the Diet out protesting physical violence, out protesting barriers to the political process, and walking on his legs, as you can see in the photo on the right. This man, Ototake Hirotada, is a quadriplegic, but he ditched his wheelchair and walked roughly 3 kilometers from Shibuya to the Diet building in protest, in a move that's been all over YouTube today for those watching. Whether he makes the election tomorrow, whether he wins, I don't know. But there's definitely going to be an ongoing conversation around how to facilitate more political participation, more accessibility, and more inclusion for more people. So I want to end this talk by just saying the future is going to be more accessible, I feel, as we're all here discussing the successes and failures of Japan's politics of inclusion, the things that have worked for some people, the things that have not worked for some people, that we're able to talk about how Japan is affecting our own cultures, how they're exporting their technologies, and how our own cultures are affecting Japan, how we are providing solutions for them. I think those conversations can and must continue. So I invite you all to join me in having them. And with that, I'll end, and I think we should move to the Q&A. So thank you very much for listening.
Mark, thank you very much indeed. That was a fascinating presentation. I learned a huge amount, and seeing some of the current developments in historical context, I think was particularly valuable. Just a note for participants, you can now unmute yourselves if you wish to ask Mark a question. Please just pipe up. We'll keep this fairly informal so that you can add in your questions at an appropriate time. Mark, there's one question in the chat from Maggie Ellis about the ISO Guide 71 for accessibility standards and the definitions of disability, different categories of disability. How do those kind of categories relate in your research? And is there a correlation between the use of these categories for guidance for designers and people creating an accessible environment, and for people like you who are researching the impacts on lack of accessibility on different groups historically and going into the future?
Sure. So I appreciate the comment. I would love to ask the person who asked it in which particular historical moment, at which particular time they're asking me to apply those standards, because obviously the definitions of disability in Japan, the categories that are used in Japanese language are not necessarily the same categories that we see used elsewhere at different points in time. So I'd love to ask for a bit of clarity around when and how they're
Can I say something, Heidi?
Please go ahead, Maggie.
Well, the ISO guides are what they say, they're international standards, and the Japanese were very, very well represented in all those discussions. So I think it's very important as an academic that you do research what has happened. I also want to point out to you that you make it sound a bit as though the Japanese government haven't done anything in this way. Now, way back at the end of the 70s, there was a major ministerial mission to Japan by the then Minister of Health with a whole group of senior people. I happened to help organize that, but that's nothing to do with it. But we visited some of the most important centers in Japan, especially those looking at gerontology. Now, following that, there have been a series of visits, including a major equivalent visit to the UK, when we looked at services in the UK. That, oddly enough, was the same time as a major development in London about activities of all kinds. Now, I think that it's also important you look at the links between the Transport Ministers Group, because again, there has been a major meeting in Tokyo of that group, including the Japanese representation. So I fully understand anybody's frustration about the lack of services for people with disability. That's an international problem, not just a Japanese one. And actually now in Japan, because, for example, within the diet, there are specific places reserved for certain professionals like nurses, which we don't have anywhere. There are things which can be better.
I will make one quick comment, which is to say, I don't think I implied the Japanese government was doing nothing. In fact, in my presentation, I had on numerous occasions how the government has been attempting to pass policies that address the gaps in the system since the immediate post-war period. And also, at no point did I imply that Japan is not engaging internationally. I would like to say that my presentation highlighted the international exchanges throughout. But I will say the ISO guidelines that you're mentioning are not necessarily what's being referenced in local Japanese policy debates, at least the ones that are related to the production of the laws that I mentioned. So I would really say that while I'm sure that there are arenas in which they were relevant, it doesn't necessarily apply to the spaces and the materials and the laws that I've spoken about today. So I thank you for the comment, and I'd love to speak more about your own experiences because they sound fascinating.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Elena, I think you have your hand up. Would you like to ask a question?
Yes, and I would like to thank Mark. That was an excellent presentation. I really appreciated it. I really appreciated the kind of political lens you used. And as a disabled philosopher myself working in bioethics, I have a question for you about critique of universal design. So I really appreciated that was part of your presentation. But as we're moving in this liminal space where society, government, however we want to phrase it, really wants to say we are post-pandemic, a lot of access that was highlighted, or access needs that were highlighted, or access that was created, for example, is being shut down because of this need to go back to normal. And people are like, well, we're doing universal design. And then you have people from disability justice perspective saying there are critiques of that, it doesn't work. And the answer I get, and this is from like a philosophical perspective, I get is like, well, if we don't have a universal principle, then it's free for all, then we don't know what to do, we can't have policy. So my question to you is, how would you answer that kind of objection of saying, well, if not universal design, then how do we move forward with policy?
Yeah. Thank you very much, and I think it's a really tough question to answer. It's one that scholars across the world have been working on. I mean, Amy Hamraya's work in the U.S. kind of comes to mind. For those who don't know, Amy has a book out, I think in 2017, if I remember correctly, called "Building Access: The Politics of Universal Design," which is a really interesting book on this topic. But I think my answer personally is always going to be universal design implementation. It's always going to be problematic for someone. And I'll give you an example. We can try and poll 100 people. We can try and get every perspective. And indeed, I was a consultant for the committee that designed the guidelines for accessible hotels, taxis, and inns, Ryokan, ahead of the Olympic Games. And on that committee, one of the questions that I was asked was, okay, Mark, what do international people with disabilities want? Washitsu or Yoshitsu? Do they want, Western style hotel rooms or Japanese style hotel rooms? And I'm like, do I look like every, disabled person you've ever seen? Could I possibly represent every perspective? Could I, as someone who uses a tall wheelchair, the tall toilet I need to transfer onto is going to make life impossible for someone in a smaller wheelchair who can't get onto that same thing. And if you design a smaller toilet, then I'm out of luck. So what do we do? How do we come up with something that's actually, universal or embodies the spirit of universal design, this sort of flexibility, this customizability? What do we do? And I think that the answer for me is just, we need to find a way to gather as many opinions as possible. We need to work on better feedback channels to make sure that disabled voices are actually getting to the table. Instead of me being the person in the room who's brought in to say, hey, you expert, come talk about the foreign perspective. Let's find a way to get more folks' opinions there. And creating a space for communication is tough. You need the technology to actually reach people. You need them to want to participate. You need them to feel comfortable participating. So I think that the next step for me is thinking about what it means to build a space for feedback, a space for having conversation around the barriers to the barriers that are stopping us, right? And that's a really tough thing to do, but I think that's where we have to start moving towards. So hopefully that provides some answer to your question.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think there's also, when you're saying a space for feedback, kind of a space to train people, disabled and non-disabled especially, to be okay with not having all the answers. And so if you have a disabled person who is saying my needs are not being met, your default answer is not that well, we follow the legal guidelines. Like that should not be like the default answer. And it's this idea that also, you know, some people use mobility aids on one day and not on the other. And training non-disabled people to not invalidate people's existence because it doesn't conform to a specific view of what a disabled person looks like, and being kind of flexible with this kind of fluidity of, you know, if I ask for needs, it's not because I want to reprimand you, it's because I need access. Can you help me? And so kind of training people in that flexibility.
Absolutely. And you highlight a very important point that I try and mention at every one of these talks that I give. And it's simply that, you know, there's this question about how much we're even aware of our needs in the first place, right? You know, as a disabled person, I may know what I need on one day. I may not need what I need on one day, but that applies to non-disabled people as much. You know, if I ask you, what is your stamina level today? How many steps can you take? How many steps must you take to be considered disabled today? You know, that number and that equation is always changing for all of us. So I think the thing we have to keep in mind is a little bit of generosity and a little bit of compassion when it comes to the fact that none of us knows what our limits are, and we all know that we need support in some way, shape, or form. So I think we have to keep that in mind as we go forward. Thank you for the question.
I think we have already gone kind of way over time, but I do really appreciate your presentation today and your insights to the audience today. And I can see from the chat how much people have valued hearing from you. So I'll put you in contact with some of the particular people who would like to follow up with you offline. But I just ask everyone to join me to thank you so much for your time this morning, and for being with the Japan Society today. Mark, it's been a privilege.
Thank you very much for having me. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to speaking with anyone and everyone who wants to reach out. Feel free.
Thank you.